All right. Good afternoon. This is Braden Savage, and I'm the Director of Alt Ed for the State Department. And I want to thank each one of you for joining us this afternoon and taking time out of your busy schedule. Today we are joined by Elizabeth Suddath, and I have the pleasure of working with Elizabeth out of our office at the State Department, the Office of Student Supports, and we're very lucky to have her expertise today. Elizabeth will be speaking to us about trauma-informed strategies for all students. So thank you, Elizabeth, for taking your time today.
All right, thank you, Braden. All right, well, good afternoon. I'm happy to be here with you all this afternoon and go through some strategies that we have for trauma-sensitive schools. So like she said, my name is Elizabeth Suddath. I am the Executive Director of Prevention Services at the State Department of Education. So what that entails, I'll give you just a brief overview of what my office covers and what possibly supports and resources I can provide to you all should you ever need them. So currently, Office of Prevention covers suicide prevention, substance abuse prevention, bullying prevention, sexual violence prevention, and dating violence prevention. So how overall can schools in Oklahoma implement a comprehensive prevention framework to address all of those different topics that students might need? So should you ever find yourself in need in any of those supports, any of those resources, or needing to know what curricula exist out there in each one of those specific areas, please feel free to send me an email. You see my email here on this screen, and I am happy to provide you any resources or supports in that area. I also am over our School Climate Transformation Grant. So should you need any resources about school climate and culture and how to shift that school climate and culture, how to assess your school climate and culture, I'm also happy to send you anything that we have regarding those topics. So today we are going to be talking about trauma-sensitive schools, specifically strategies that you can use in your classroom or in your school building. I do want to mention that this is a part 2. So I will quickly go over the basics and an overview of trauma and ACEs, but just so you know that this presentation will not go into depth and into detail about how trauma affects behavior and different types of brain development and behaviors that you are seeing in the building and what ACEs stands for. But you can go back to the Alternative Education webpage, and we did a Understanding the Basics of Trauma webinar this time last year. So you can look for that if you need just a little bit more detail about some of these topics that I will be going over. But we will go ahead and get started. So like I said, I will do a brief overview and I will try and get through this as quickly as possible. I tend to start talking way more about basics than I need to when I do overviews. But let's go through and just talk about what are the basics of trauma, so we have a baseline knowledge just going through the rest of this presentation. So what do we know about trauma? We know that trauma is anything that changes the brain's development. A lot of time examples that we think of include abuse, assault, natural disaster, and death of a loved one. But really we know anything can lead to trauma depending upon the person and the circumstance. So we know that the brain starts developing from the bottom up to the top. What I mean from that, as a baby developing in utero, the very first area of the brain that starts developing is that brain stem. The next area of the brain that develops is the limbic brain. And then the area of the brain that starts developing after that is the neocortex, or this higher order thinking of the brain. Now there's a lot more that goes into brain development than just those 3 areas, but for the purposes of this presentation, those are the 3 areas that I will focus on. So when an infant is born, the area of their brain that is most developed is the brainstem and the limbic brain. And this is what is oftentimes referred to as the primitive brain. So this is the brain that is running off of emotions or those reflexes that we see infants have, or a fight, flight, or freeze response. That's why, or within the limbic brain, we see a lot of emotions. That's where emotions are housed. That's why babies are born with a full range and a lot of emotions. The next area of the brain that starts developing is that neocortex. And that can actually be developing until the age of 24 or 25 years old. And this is the area of the brain that is what makes modern day humans human. So this is the area of the brain that higher order thinking takes place. This is the area of the brain that students can learn new information. This is the area of the brain that we can have healthy communication and those peer relationship skills, and just all of those skills that make us more of that modern human that we think of. Oftentimes you will hear this referred to as the upstairs brain, while the limbic brain and the brainstem are referred to as the downstairs brain. So just going back to that quickly, when we're talking about brain development, since the brain is developing until about the age of 24 years old, we are working with a lot of students who do not have fully developed brains. And that's why ACEs and trauma can be so impactful on children and adolescents and the students that we are working with. Since they do not have fully developed brains, then any experiences that they're having in their life, if they are reflected back to these ACEs or any type of trauma or adversity, this can actually change the way that the brain is developing. It can change the chemistry and the entire brain structure of the student that we are working with. So this is, I oftentimes get asked if adults can experience trauma. Since if they already have a fully developed brain, can somebody still experience trauma? And yes, that brain structure and function can shift still over time, but that's why students are most susceptible to trauma, and that actually is changing the way that that brain is developing because they do not have fully developed brains yet. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And again, if you want more detail, you can go back and watch that part 1 that we go more into detail about ACEs and trauma and brain development. But basically, ACEs is a study that researchers Dr. Vincent Folletti and Dr. Robert Anda from the CDC started looking at what is actually changing the way that the brain is structured and what are the underlying causes to the shift in the brain structuring and the neural pathways that we're seeing in the brain that is changing due to trauma. And what they decided is to go back and ask participants these top 10 questions for adverse experiences. So I do not have the quiz on this webinar, but you can go back and find the ACEs quiz if you have not seen this before. I do encourage you though, before you look up those questions, to make sure that you are in a safe and supportive emotional environment, for the questions can be incredibly triggering, and they go into a lot of detail before the age of 18 years old. But just general, the way that ACEs or the ACEs questions is broken down is in 3 categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. There's 3 questions on abuse: physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse. 2 questions on neglect, physical or emotional, and 5 questions on household dysfunction: mental illness, domestic violence in the home, divorce or abandonment in the home, an incarcerated relative, and substance abuse. So if somebody was going through these questions and they said yes to physical abuse, yes to emotional neglect, and yes to an incarcerated relative, they would have an ACE score of a 3 out of a 10. And this is what this study looked for. What does these ACEs, or what is this set of experiences in someone's life, how does that affect the brain development, and how does that affect behavior or health outcomes later? So what they found from this ACE study is that those with an ACE score of 3 or higher are considered at risk for the following: twice as likely to become a smoker, 7 times more likely to be an alcoholic, 10 times more likely to inject street drugs, more likely to be violent, have multiple marriages, more drug prescriptions, more depression, more broken bones, more autoimmune diseases, and more school or work absences. So if we go back to this ACE score or these ACEs questions, getting to a 3 is not that hard through these questions. And we know that all of these negative health risk behaviors can follow that. And also what we know about statistics in Oklahoma is a lot of these ACE scores are tied to some of our most prevalent statistics that we are seeing. So we know that students who are just being born in Oklahoma, due to some of the health risks that we are facing and some of the challenges that we face in our state, are at an increased risk for having an ACE score. Now, I do want to mention just before we move on that there's oftentimes people will link the two ACE scores causes trauma. So what we know about ACEs and adverse childhood experiences is that someone is at a higher risk for experiencing trauma, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have trauma if there is a high ACE score. What qualifies for trauma is if we do see the changes in the brain structure, in that brain chemistry that I was talking about. So what might you see in some students? What are some warning signs that you might notice? So difficulty trusting others, social isolation, difficulty seeking help, hypersensitive to physical contact, increased medical, emotional, and mental problems, problems with coordination and balance, poor affect regulation, problems with academic achievement, oppositional antisocial behaviors, and difficulty planning for the future. So again, this is just those 3 areas of the brain that we went through. So let's say that a student has had some sort of ACE or some sort of trauma in their life. What does the brain do? So the brain actually releases anytime somebody is feeling stress or anytime someone is in an adverse experience, the brain will release a stress hormone called cortisol. For children and students who are chronically exposed to this stress hormone, this is actually what is changing the structure of the brain. So this cortisol, which was supposed to be life-saving in dangerous situations, can actually become health damaging to students who are experiencing it over and over and over due to the amount of adversity that they are living in, due to the amount of trauma if they're living in it every single day. So that's when you start seeing the changes in the brain structure. So how does this affect behavior at school? So if somebody does have these changes in their brain structure, they have experienced trauma in their life, then there is a high chance that, or high likelihood that they will have some sort of trigger or experience this form of cortisol when they're in our school buildings as well. So when the brain experiences cortisol, if those brain structures have already started changing, then this is when you see a lot of those behaviors come out in students. So if you can recognize a student who is in their neocortex, you know this because they are able to sit down, do their work, take in new information, or have those positive peer-to-peer conversations or relationships. Let's say some sort of trigger pops up for this student, some sort of reminder of the trauma that they have experienced pops up. And if you've ever heard the term, they just flipped their lid, that's exactly what you can think of. They flip their lid out of their neocortex and go down either into the limbic brain or into the brain stem. We know a student is in their limbic brain when they are running on emotions, really high hysterical emotions, or low lack of emotions, completely numb and withdrawn. Or if you see a student down in brainstem, what you're likely to see is a fight, flight, or freeze response. So either they are physically fighting in your building, or they're verbally fighting, or they flight, they have to get out of that situation, they just run right out of the door, or they freeze. They become, again, that numb and withdrawn and not able to communicate within that moment. In order to be trauma informed, we have to recognize which area of the brain students are operating in at all times. And if we notice that a student has flipped their lid, they have gone down into that downstairs brain, what strategies can we put in place to release that cortisol and get them back up into that neocortex? Because that's actually the only time we can have conversations with students and that we can talk about patterns of behavior is when they are in their neocortex. So that's what the remainder of this presentation will be about, is what strategies can we use to release cortisol in the brain and to get students back up into their neocortex. And why do we need trauma-informed schools? One of the biggest reasons is a lot of research shows that one single variable that can actually start changing the brain structure for a lot of these students and can start reversing the effects of ACEs and trauma is even having one caring adult. A caring adult who believed in them and cared about their well-being, and that the student really felt like that adult was looking out for them. So when we have trauma-informed strategies, it helps students feel safe, and then they learn how to self-regulate. If we have students who can self-regulate when they are in that flipped lid, then we have students who are able to return to that neocortex on their own, and then we have more opportunities for learning for the rest of the class. We have more opportunities to relate to that student and to engage with that student when we teach those self-regulation skills. What we know is when students learn to self-regulate, classroom disturbances go down and academic scores go up. So being trauma-informed requires a shift in the way that we look at traditional classroom management. So it's not based off of a punishment system, but it's based off a system that we're teaching new behaviors. We are teaching students how to rewire their brains. So that might go against a lot of what you have traditionally heard about classroom discipline approaches. It changes how policies are developed and implemented in schools when we're encountering students who have been affected by trauma. And it also has a ripple effect across the entire school environment and culture. A big piece of a trauma-informed is focusing on your school climate and culture. When you walk into your school building, what do students feel? What do you feel? That's your climate. And what shifts do we need to make in order to be a trauma-informed school climate? And it involves administration, teachers, staff, students, and families. So what we know is there's no greater intervention than a student having a safe relationship. So it's not about a curriculum that I can hand to you. It's not about a toolkit that you need to implement into your school. Really what it is about students feeling safe in the building in which they are in, or in the room, or in the space in which they are in. We know when students feel safe, they are less likely to be triggered. And students who are less likely to be triggered have their cortisol levels reduced in their brain. And the more we can reduce cortisol levels in the brain, then we have students who are able to stay in that neocortex longer. So we are going to go through 4 steps to a trauma-informed school. So each one of these steps I will just go through quickly, and then the rest of the presentation is breaking down these 4 steps into specific strategies that you can use and implement. So the first step that we are going to talk about is allowing the student to de-escalate and regulate again before solving the issue at hand. So we know that we have to release that cortisol. We have to release that stress hormone in the brain, allow the student to de-escalate if they're in their downstairs brain, regulate back up into that neocortex before we have any conversations with that student at all. We know it's never about the current issue. It goes much deeper. We can think about behaviors in the classroom as an iceberg. What we're actually seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. And what we need to know is that it goes much deeper than that. Everything below the surface is ACEs, is trauma. It's what the triggers are popping up for that student. It's what the student went through right before they walked into that school building that day. So a lot of those things that I just talked about is creating an internal chaos for those students. If you have those increased cortisol levels, that increased stress hormone, we have that flipped lid, we have the structures of the brain actually changing. What that is an internal chaos, and the brain says, make me feel better. I am not okay in this moment, and you need to do whatever it takes to make me feel better. If students have never been taught skills of what is going to make the brain feel better to release that cortisol, then they go to the easiest option or to the option that has always worked for them in the past. And this is what creates those neural pathways to behaviors. So if fight, flight, or freeze has always worked for them in the past, and that's how they have survived situations up until this point in life, that is exactly what the brain is going to take over and say, okay, we need to fight our way out of this situation. That is an internal dialogue. That is an internal safety mechanism that the brain takes over, says, I know this works. This is what we're going to do. So all of that is an internal process, but what we're seeing is the external representation of that internal chaos. So we have to stop and think, what is driving this behavior? What is actually causing the student to behave in this way or to perform in this way? So we also know it is a brain issue, not a behavioral issue. So students aren't just bad kids or behavior problems. It is a brain issue. Everything that I just talked about, the experiences that somebody has in life, is what leads to the way that their brain is wired. And if someone is living in trauma and in adversity, their brain is wired for trauma and adversity. So that is a brain issue, not just a behavior problem. So my job is to help the student regulate, not to make them behave. The more we can focus on regulation skills, then the more we can actually start seeing those brain and those neural pathways start to be rewired in the brain, because we know that brains can be rewired. At any age, the brain can be rewired. Think about how hard that actually is. It sounds a lot more simple than what it actually is. Because if we're truly trying to rewire a student's brain in a student's way that they are reacting in their survival skills and their coping skills, just know that takes a lot of patience and that takes a lot of time, especially with older students and students that have had these set and established patterns of behavior for a long time. But it can be done. Discipline should always be to teach, not to punish. If we only focus on punishment to change behavior, then we are losing the battle. Because you have students who say, punish me all day long, I do not care, or that's exactly the punishment that I wanted. That was the outcome that I was looking for. But when we discipline students, we are teaching students how to change their, again, those brain, the way that the brain is wired, changing those patterns of behavior. So we're not simply just focusing on a punishment, we're focusing on replacement behaviors. So the very first place that we need to start when we talk about strategies is, what is our perspective of students? So when we are working with students, there is only one person that we can actually control in that building or in that classroom, and that's ourselves. So what is our perspective? What are our triggers? What are we dealing with throughout the school day that might be triggering to students, or that might change the way I interact with that student? So it goes from the old way of thinking to the new. He is so defiant, transforms into, he is lacking social skills. If you tell me I have a student who is so defiant, that is a student that I'm going to come into with preconceived notions. But if you tell me that I have a student coming into my class who is lacking social skills, that's something I can work with. We can start building on social skills throughout the year. We're identifying the lagging skills and how we can build upon them. She is choosing this behavior, turns into she is reacting with adrenaline and survival skills. What is wrong with him? Turns into what happened to him. I don't need to call home. They won't help. Calling home may give me some more insight. I will not tolerate disrespect. Goes into how can I help them learn respect? What lessons can I start incorporating throughout the day that will teach patterns of respect that quite possibly these students have never heard before? So it's all about safe relationships. First, what you want to do is clarify your role with this student. Establish yourself as a safe individual, and know that students don't automatically assume that you are a safe individual, especially if their ACEs, their high ACE score, or ACEs at all comes from an adult. Their brain is primed to mistrust adults. So it might take a little bit more effort to establish yourself as a safe individual and to really show that student that you are a safe individual. Create an environment of respect and talk about safety and what steps you will take to help the student feel and be safe. Again, it's all about empowering the students. So we want to shift from using a dynamic that is all about power and control and using threats and intimidation, isolation, minimizing and denying, and using our position of power as an adult in the room. What we want to do is shift to sharing some power with the students. Constantly be looking for ways throughout the day that I can empower a student to make choices, especially a student who oftentimes have choices robbed from them every single day, depending upon the situation in which they're living. How can I incorporate new choices? Can I give choices for homework? Can I give choices of consequences? Can I give choices of where they're even, or what assignments or activities we're going to go through that day? Because the more choices we can give students, we start creating, again, those new neural pathways. Knowing that mistakes are okay and that mistakes are going to happen and you will always have a second chance. And that we're in this together, and knowing that it's okay to seek a compromise with students as well. And that will only empower them more and give them skills, again, that they may have not been taught before. So how do we release some of that cortisol from the brain and get students back up into the neocortex? When I go through these strategies, you may think to yourself, these are all things that I've done in the past, or these are strategies that I'm currently using. But the way that the rest of this presentation is designed is for you to think of them in a more systematic way. And how can I incorporate this into my classroom or school plan? So again, if we have a student who is experiencing a trigger or something pops up for them during the day, they flip their lid out of the neocortex into the limbic brain or brainstem. They have a brain that is full of cortisol. The first thing that we want, or the first place that we want to start, is thinking about possible triggers for students. How do we make our schools or our classrooms as trigger-free as possible? So here is a list of possible student triggers and possible parent triggers. So loud, chaotic environments, physical touch, witnessing violence, any changes in routine, or feeling embarrassed can be one of those triggers that sends the student to flip their lid. Now, if we identify that a student is triggered by loud and chaotic environments, then we know that we need to make sure that we have extra supports in place in loud and chaotic environments in the school. Or if we notice the environment getting a little bit loud, checking in on that student. So it is important to start thinking through what are some possible triggers in this moment, or that this child is, or the student is experiencing. It's also really important to note that you may never be able to identify a trigger, and that is okay too. It is not completely your responsibility to identify every single trigger for every single student and know exactly how to avoid all of those throughout the day. because not even us, or not even us as educators, as adults, know what's going to trigger us in every single way. So it's impossible for a student to know until they are in that, until they are experiencing that feeling. And sometimes memories can just resurface. Sometimes it's a smell. There's a lot of things that is outside of our control. And know that that is completely okay. But we just want to be mindful in those moments that we're thinking through, could this behavior be a result of, again, that internal chaos that is happening? And even knowing that parents can have triggers as well. So oftentimes the stories that I hear about triggers for parents is actually in the school building. So going to the school building, or driving, or dropping students off, or even getting a call from the teacher or an educator or administrator, that can be a trigger for a parent based off of experiences that they have had in their life. So just keeping all of those things in mind. So quickly, I just want you to just stop and think, and we won't pause and spend too much time on here. Which areas of the school, which areas in your school building do students who experience these triggers need the most support? So just thinking through your school building, if you know that there are possible triggers and you can sit and identify some triggers for students that you work with, what supports can you start putting in? So how can we start providing these students with these extra strategies during those moments? So what we know about regulation is that motivation is more about self-regulation than making a choice to follow the rules. So if you have a student who is not following the rules, then this is oftentimes because they are in that flipped lid. They are not in an area of their brain that is about making a choice to follow the rules or to not follow the rules. That would have to take place in the neocortex. So if we offer regulation skills and we're able to get students up into their neocortex, they're more likely than not to follow those rules and to make a decision to do that. So if you think about a reward system or a system within your school that takes through the thought process of, okay, if I don't want to be suspended, or if I don't want to get in trouble, then I don't need to do this behavior. So I need to avoid this trigger in my life. Therefore, I won't get in trouble and I won't be suspended. Or the opposite, if I want this reward that is in my school, maybe I want to be able to go and sit in on this special class, then I need to make a choice to do right, and I need to be in control of all of those choices. In order to have that very linear thought process, the student has to be in their neocortex. So if you have a student's brain who is wired when they're feeling stressed or they're in a chaotic situation to flip their lid, then it's no longer about a choice and going through that linear thought process. What we need to get students to start thinking about is, how am I going to regulate my brain in this moment? How do I recognize that I'm in a flipped lid? How do I recognize that I'm in my downstairs brain? And how do I get back up to that upstairs brain? So it's not, again, about a choice in that moment. It's about, how do I use my regulation skills? So some regulation skills that you can teach students that are just really quick and easy, but they have a lot of brain science behind them. ABC 1, 2, 3 is a great strategy that you can use. Now, it might sound, when you teach students at the first, it might sound a little like it's for a little kid, but this is really great for every age group. I do this often in trainings, and every time we do this, even together as adults, everyone feels so much better afterwards. And it's because it starts to
Sorry.
Were you okay? Sorry about that. So it starts to reintegrate the brain function of the hippocampus, so in the on one side of the brain with the prefrontal cortex. So what you will do is have a student say their ABCs out loud and draw a corresponding number with that. So when I say A out loud, I draw 1. When I say B out loud, I draw a 2 in the air. And when I say C out loud, I draw a 3 in the air. And then I go all the way to Z and have them keep drawing their numbers in the air. Again, that reintegrates the two different areas of the brain. Having them focus and visualize colors with focused breathing. So if I tell you to visualize a color that makes you angry, oftentimes what I hear is people say they would visualize the color red. So in that moment, we have a student who maybe is about to flip their lid, and I tell them to do their breathing exercise and visualize the color blue. I want you to breathe in for 5 seconds, visualize the color blue, and then breathe out for 5 seconds. What we know is even just visualizing the color blue or a calming and soothing color, and then focusing on breathing actually reduces the heart rate. It reduces the amount of cortisol that is in the brain. Having a regulation station or a calm room or a calm center, this can look like just a beanbag or a chair in the corner of the room or a specified location within your building. I would suggest having either one of those options. So it can be as simple as just a place that students can go and listen to music with headphones, read a book. Blowing bubbles is a really good way, again, to calm the breath and start focusing on that deep breathing exercises. Or we can have them work on different things. Anything that student identifies is a regulation strategy for them and helps them calm down. One of the worst things that we can do is to recognize that a student is experiencing cortisol, is in a flipped lid, and offer them no strategies for how to deal with it in that situation. We don't want that student who is recognizing those things, having those emotions, feeling all of that chaos internally, to just sit in their chair and dwell and have it escalate that all the way down into that flipped lid. Want to make sure they have some sort of place or some sort of strategy they can use. Movement is a great way to get students out of, or at any age, to release cortisol from the brain, especially repetition. So repetition is actually ingrained in our DNAs to be, to be soothing. When a baby is in utero, the mother's heartbeat is a constant repetition or a repetitive movement. They hear that rhythm over and over. So it is ingrained in the DNA to be soothed by rhythm. So the more we can allow repetitive movement or some sort of activity, incorporating brain breaks throughout the day at any age, we need to make sure we incorporate some way that the students can get up and move around. Allowing a student to rock, having a rocking chair, or allowing them to go to an area of the building and pace back and forth. Maybe you have a piece of tape that's just in the hallway somewhere that the student can walk back and forth on that piece of tape. What we know is, again, that repetitive movement is resetting the brain. Even if you start to notice that maybe your class is starting to glaze over a little bit, you start to see them be withdrawn, or you notice that one student is getting agitated, you can have them just stand up and do really quick air squats. I've done that before in a classroom. And it's a great way to just get them up and moving. And every time you ask them after that, they always feel so much better. All of these different movements and techniques that you can use, again, there is a lot of brain science behind them. They sound so simple, but what they're doing, again, is resetting those two different sides of the brain. And the more we can change those brain waves and those brain patterns, then cortisol is able to be released. Listening to music is a great way to, again, change the brain wave patterns. There's a lot of research about what instrumental music can do for the brain. And it was one of the top strategies and top resources to actually reset the cortisol stress hormones that's going on in brain. Specifically instrumental music, we know there's a lot of music out there that can actually agitate and make the brain feel more chaos. So we want to make sure that it is that instrumental music that we are providing to students. So if you are having a tough one-on-one conversation with a student, or you're in a very stressful part of the day, or you're in a stressful part of an assignment, play some instrumental music in the background and see those cortisol levels start to lower, and you actually start shifting the entire environment, and you're changing the brain waves for the students that you're working with. White noise machines can also be a great way to change those brain wave patterns. Having a tap in, tap out system. So for students, this can look like a class that they can go and sit in if they need to. They just need a break from either where they're at, their environment in that moment. It's just somewhere that they can go for a little bit to reset their brain. But we want to make sure it's always positively framed and before a major misbehavior. Now, how I've seen this implemented in high school classes is one student who was having particularly rough time with some of his peers that were in the classroom. He would have a flipped lid often throughout the school week. So what the teacher did is they went and worked with this student that he could have a special pass. He could have a tap in, tap out system. And he could use this pass at any time that he wanted to when he needed just a break from what was going on. So this teacher implemented this strategy, and what she noticed is over time, the student was never using this pass, but his classroom behavior had gotten so much better. There were almost zero classroom disruptions from this particular student. One day this teacher went up and asked him, what has happened? What has changed for you? I've noticed you're not using this pass, but you seem to be doing so much better. And his response to her was, just knowing that I have it is enough. Sometimes students just need to know that they have a way out, and that can help reset their brain. That can help release the cortisol. Educators always know your boundaries, know what your triggers are, know when you need to have a break, know when you need to use some of these self-regulation skills, and prepare ahead of time for that. And the more we can use self-regulation skills in front of students, whatever strategy works for us, then the more they can see that behavior modeled, and they know that it's okay to engage in these strategies as well, and that we're also human. We also have this internal chaos that can happen for us. So how we want to identify that iceberg that I was talking about is not that, again, students are behavior problems, but that they have lagging skills. So for every student that we notice who has lagging skills in maybe one of these social emotional areas, we want to make sure we are trying to build these lagging skills. That is what is replacing the behavior. Examples of lagging skills: poor sense of time, difficulty maintaining focus, chronic irritability, lacking basic social skills, or difficulty showing empathy. Again, a lagging skill is just a way to positively reframe that conversation. So this is just an example of a lagging skill form that you can use in your classroom. I am happy to send this out to you all if you want to email me. But basically what you will do if you notice a lagging skill, then you will create this form for that student. And then you can go through and circle every lagging skill that you notice for that student you're working with. So based off that, this is the backside of that paper. We will identify our lagging skills, and then the unsolved problems portion is where you will write the specific problems that you are noticing with that student. From there, we create a development of skills plan. So we take our top 3 unsolved problems. Maybe there's only one problem that you want to address, and you have that one-on-one conversation with the student about these unsolved problems. Now, again, remember, this can be a stressful conversation, so try and play some instrumental music in the background. But what you want to do is get the students' concerns around those lagging skills or those unsolved problems. Make them feel like let them know that they have a voice and they are empowered in this development of skills plan as well. Then you will voice your concerns and what you would like to see changed with these unsolved problems, and then you agree upon a solution together. And then you will write out what solution you have agreed upon. Then you can use a modified check-in, check-out system that student checks in with you on their development of skills plan. You can write just really clear what are solutions that we agreed upon and what they will be working on first, second, or third, or however many unsolved problems you're wanting to work with. And then they will check with you either every day, every week, how often you establish with them in the morning or at the end of the day, on a Monday, on a Friday, about the progress that is being made on those unsolved, on those unsolved problems. When we talk about de-escalation, this is something that is still really important. Let's say we have a student who is in that flipped lid. They have gone down into that downstairs brain. What are safe de-escalation techniques we can use? So first, we want to make sure that we remove every other student from the classroom and not the student who is escalated. So that means having a plan with your students ahead of time of what you will do if a situation does arise in the classroom. They all know to stand up, line up, and go to the next teacher's classroom or whichever teacher you identify. What you want to do is make sure you give them space and then contact anyone who needs to be contacted in those situations. Watch your tone of voice and body language. If you seem very tense, that will also add more cortisol in their brain, and they are just focusing on your body language in that moment. Not so much the words you're saying, but how you are saying them. So we want to make sure we are not increasing the cortisol or escalating that student any further. We want to try and listen to identify a trigger. If the student is down in their brainstem, or if they're not wanting to talk, they are that numb and withdrawn, we are not going to force that student to discuss what their trigger is in that moment. You want to make sure you promote cooperation. Don't block any exits, and not to take it as a personal attack. So some things that do not promote de-escalation is telling a student to look at you. You want to make sure, again, you're giving them space, watching that tone of voice and your body language. Making sure there's no physical contact with the student, making sure you're not blocking any exits, raising your voice, or adding too many people to the room. I know I have been in situations where a student has been highly escalated, and before I knew it, there was about 15 other adults in that room, and that student just got even more so escalated. So having a policy, something in place that we know who exactly needs to be in that room, and there's as few adults as possible. So then moving into discipline is to teach, not to punish. So what we know about this cycle of trauma is that trauma oftentimes does lead to some sort of psychological damage. So the changing in the brain structure, which can lead to emotional damage, which oftentimes, not every time, will lead to a behavior problem. And usually traditionally how we have focused on behavior problems in the past is treating it with punishment. If we are only treating with punishment, that is just sending students right back into this cycle of trauma. So where we want to make sure we get off on this cycle is at that behavior problem, and we're using teaching new patterns of behavior. So what this looks like is having a very clear school plan. So either a school site plan for what is exact expectations for behaviors, not only what can you not do, but what do we expect you to do in this school to be successful? What are we actually looking for? Assess the school climate. A great way to do this is through student surveys or through focus groups. I do have copies of school climate surveys for students if that is something you are interested in sending out, so you can assess exactly what is going on in your climate. Your students are the ones who, there's the most of them. They know, they are the experts of the school. They know exactly what the climate is. They know exactly what is going on for them. So asking them what's happening, what do you think is going on here? How do you feel like our school climate is a great way to also empower them and build up those new skills. So again, we want to make sure we have a really clear plan for expectations of behaviors. This is just one example of expectations for behaviors that you can have in your school or in your classroom. Something I want to point out, if you do have expectations for behaviors, make sure you are incorporating some of those trauma-informed strategies that we were talking about. So using my breathing technique is a trauma-informed strategy that can be incorporated into behavior expectations. So again, teaching those new patterns of behavior, going from punitive to trauma-informed. Punitive focuses on the action, trauma-informed focuses on the behavior. So we go from just focusing on what actually happened and punishing to finding out what's going on, allowing the student to take responsibility, and then giving consequences that teach new patterns of behavior. So being trauma-informed is not about not giving any consequences or letting students get away with anything that they want. It is about looking at consequences differently. So what might this look like? Let's say if you have a in-school placement program or some sort of consequence for the student, you want to make sure that all trauma-informed staff, or all staff, is trained in trauma-informed. You can start off your mornings with regulation techniques. So focusing on mindfulness, focusing on breathing techniques, using the calming corner. A lot of times students are coming in already with a lot of cortisol in their brain, already agitated. So we want to start the day off with releasing that cortisol. Allow them time to use the calming corner if needed, allow time throughout the day to use that calming corner if needed. And starting off every day with a class meeting. It can be even just a quick 5-minute meeting, checking in, knowing that we are here to support each other, and what are some things that we are going to go through today together. And then you have academic time. And then what's really important is having time for social emotional learning, supports added in. So let's say if the student focuses half of their time on academic, the other half can be spent on some of these lagging skills that we were talking about. And how do we build those replacement behaviors? There's some really great free social emotional learning tools out there. There is one that I want to highlight really quickly, and it's called Overcoming Obstacles. So this is a tool that you can use. It is a free online account you can go in and create. If you just Google Overcoming Obstacles, then you can go in, click on the grade level you are working with, click on the lagging skill that you are seeing in that student, and you can print off free social emotional learning programs or worksheets or guides in English and also in Spanish. So again, we're really working with students on how do we address, how do we promote new skills that is going to change the way the student is behaving. And then the last thing we always want to focus on is hope and resilience. So what we know is a student who can focus on hope, who can go to the area of their brain that they're able to think about hope and hope for a future, that is the best way to create new neural pathways. Because we know that resiliency is greater than ACEs. And if we have students who have higher resiliency and higher hope, then they start reversing the impact that ACEs has had in their life. So we know resiliency is bouncing back from negative events in life, and hope is wanting more. So the more we can have students get out of that survival area of the brain, how am I just going to survive day to day? You want me to think about graduation? I don't even know where dinner is coming from. We can have them get out of that survival area up to the area of hope and wanting more out of life. That is when we start seeing brains really be rewired. We know higher hope people do better in life than lower hope people. We actually know that somebody's hope score is more predictive of post-secondary success than even the ACT or the SAT. So students who we can instill hope in, instill resiliency, start creating those neuro pathways, they do better in life, and they are able to really start reversing those effects of the ACEs. A great way to do this is having, we know that higher hope students are a greater influence on lower hope students. So if you can pair up higher hope students with lower hope students, then we know actually that the higher hope is going to raise up that lower hope. Offering peer mentoring groups for increasing hope. So how can we get students involved in any sort of peer mentoring? Also mentoring maybe at that elementary level or with younger students. Assigning a senior or somebody who is in a program for longer with somebody who is brand new in the program, and seeing that mentor relationship, that can actually instill hope and resilience as well. So what we know is that there are protective factors against ACEs, and the more protective factors a student has, the more likely that the less likely ACEs is to affect their brain development. So these protective factors oftentimes are called PACEs. So someone can have an ACE score, but they can also have a PACE score. We want to make sure we focus on the PACE score of students. Someone who has an ACE score of 6 but a PACE score of 8 is more protected against trauma than somebody who has a lower PACE score. So there are 10 PACEs that we can look to start building in students we're working with. Having someone who loved you unconditionally, that positive adult relationship. Having at least one best friend. How can we link students to other people within our education programs? Doing regularly things to help others or special projects in the community. Have an adult other than a parent you can trust. Being a member of at least one social group. What groups or organizations can we start to form and have students be a part of, or linking them to community groups? Having an engaging hobby and involved in some sort of sport or other physical activity. Living in a home that was typically clean and safe with enough food to eat. Have a school that provided the resources and experiences you needed to learn. And being in a school where the rules were clear and fairly administered. So all of those things, we can go back and start looking of what can I build up in students, again, that I see who have lagging scores or lagging skills, or that I know have gone through a lot of adversity. And we can start seeing those ACEs be reduced. So what we know for students, in order to have hope, there's 3 things that they need. They need to have a goal. So what goals can we step with students? How can they see the pathways to achieve these goals? And how do they have the mental energy or motivation to travel down this pathway? How can they have that resiliency? And those are all 3 elements that we can instill in students and we can help them with in order, again, to create those new neural pathways of hope. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that I at least ended on those hope scores and talking about instilling hope with students, because again, that is going to be one of the most productive parts, and where we really start seeing students shift in their mindset and start shifting in having those new patterns of behavior and rewiring their brains. Thank you all for being with me this afternoon. I really appreciate it. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I am more than happy to help or to provide you with any resources. All right, thank you.